Well, welcome to Chatham House. Thank you for those that have managed to come through despite all of the strikes this morning. And you're obviously richly rewarded with questions. But it is going to be a fascinating discussion. My name is Anthony Froggatt, and I'm a Senior Research Fellow here at Chatham House, working in environment and society. I'll be the moderator for the discussion today. And I think, as everyone is aware, we are here to discuss and celebrate, if we can use that word, the launch of Brexit and Energy Law with Anna and Silke, who are the editors and chief contributors to this unique novel. I'd just like to remind people that this will be on the record, so we're not using the Chatham House rule, but I think that should be fine in terms of what we're discussing today. So for those that don't know, Anna was founded the E&A Law in 2007, and the following 12 years has worked in government and major legal firms based in London since 1998, and has worked internationally across a range of sectors, and obviously in particular around energy. And Silke works with Smith Freehills, over the last 17 years, working on energy, and we have worked together since before the referendum on Brexit issues. So I'm absolutely delighted to welcome them both here. I guess I just want to say a couple of words before handing the floor over to them. I think we all recognise that energy and climate is a core government priority. And I think you only need to look at the integrated review that was published earlier this week, in which they said on climate change, and I'll quote because I was quite surprised by it, said, "Climate change and biodiversity loss are important multipliers of other global threats and are guaranteed to continue to worsen over the next decade." So really there is a recognition from the heart of government of this situation will get worse in relation to climate change. And then on energy, they said, the first priority area in addressing the UK's vulnerabilities is energy security. So absolutely recognition that these are front and centre. And then the integrated review goes on to talk about the importance of international cooperation in both of these areas. So in the relation to energy, it talks about the EU, it talks about the G7, the strategic partnership with the US, the Gulf states, etc. And then they talk about climate change as being an important, in some ways, opportunity to work with China in terms of trying to increase cooperation between the rest of the world and China. So I think very clear that the government recognises this is an absolute priority, recognises that international cooperation is fundamental. But yet I think I would argue that in terms of Brexit, it wasn't a key topic. It wasn't a topic of conversation on the public level and on the political level. So that's why I think this book is so important, because it is a process that is ongoing in terms of Brexit. And we know that the energy situation is changing and has changed hugely over the last year. So, it's important that we recognise this and use this as an opportunity to see where we are and maybe look forward. So in terms of the format today, I thought that what we thought we'd do is Anna, we'll start with Silke, who will give a little overview of the book, so that you're all tempted to rush out and buy it and pass it on to your colleagues. And then Anna will touch upon sort of where we are in terms of Brexit, the current situation. And then we've got a few topics that we want to talk through in terms of cross-border arrangements, state aid, etc., and have that as more as a conversational. So we're not doing large opening remarks, but just introducing the book and then beginning a conversation. And those online, please do feel free to jump in as with the people in the room. Just raise your hand, unmute yourself, and then you can then just put forward your points or questions. So I will then like to hand over to Silke.
Thank you very much, Anthony, and thank you very much, everybody, first of all, for hosting, and thank you very much, everybody who came in person and dialed in. I'm delighted to see in particular that there are a few authors who've dialed in as well, or who've come in person in spite of all the strikes. It falls to me to give a very brief overview of the book. And I was discussing actually sort of the concept of a book on Brexit and energy with somebody yesterday, and they were saying, oh, surely sort of there must have been written loads about this. Well, and then actually I started to reflect, and Anthony, I think your research that you've led here out of Chatham House and the staying connected research that you've conducted here is probably the first publication, comprehensive publication on Brexit and energy, but this is the first book that first focuses exclusively on Brexit and energy, and also in the breadth of the detail. So the motto of the government, of the current government when they got elected, was "Get Brexit Done." And I think this is a theme that runs through the book, that Brexit is actually a continuous process. In many of the areas which the authors have examined in this book, it shows that it never quite got done, and there are lots and lots of issues that they're all encompassing in many areas of the energy sector. First of all is, what is post-Brexit trade in energy, in gas and electricity? But led for many to the discussion, what is electricity and what is gas in terms of a WTO order? Because electricity trading arrangements post-Brexit are, of course, on no deal terms. There is no clear energy trading regime as of yet. And so Eric White explores sort of what does this mean for WTO terms. Eric is one of the specialists on WTO, and that then follows, okay, so we know what it is a good, we can trade it, there's a very limited regime in place, so there are no taxes, no custom applied to it. That then leads to the question of access. We can trade it, but how can UK companies access the EU market, and what are the terms and conditions? So access, is fair to say, as a whole has worsened. National rules become much more important. For instance, in France, whereas previously, if still European Union countries are able to obtain licenses, for instance, supply licenses or generation licenses from the ministry in France, post-Brexit, UK companies can no longer obtain these licenses because, well, they're not in the European Union, and there are a number of issues that pertain to how do we trade it? We trade it across interconnectors. The regime for interconnectors has worsened in terms of trade as well, which then in case led us to examining the impact of Brexit on supply security. Paul Hallers, who many of you know from the Chatham House discussion rounds on Brexit, of course, has explored the UK security of supply post-Brexit and sort of pointed out the number of weaknesses that have arisen, in particular because of the uncertainty, for instance, in relation to the trading regime. I've then looked at it from the EU supply security to conclude that perhaps the EU as a whole will be fine without the UK. However, Ireland is a different story. There are very many specific issues that pertain to the island of Ireland and that Brexit has caused. George Perez, KC, then looks at what about state aid in Brexit? What is sort of what's the impact on the energy sector here? Because if we want to sort of maintain supply security, trade and investment in the sector, under what circumstances can the state support this? And what does the state aid regime look like post-Brexit? The UK is one of the first countries to have a state aid regime outside of the European Union in this form, and George explores that. Anna and Julian Bowden then go on and to say, okay, we want not only energy, we don't only want energy security generally, but we want renewable energy and climate change policies in this area. And Anna and Julian then go on to explore what the implications of Brexit are, specifically from a renewable energies policy perspective. Jana Neiston and Fabian Pauser, I can see Jana, I've seen dialing in somewhere as well, then continue to look at the same question on renewable energy and climate change policy, but from a European Union perspective. And this is effectively something that sort of threads through the entire book. Brexit has an impact. It surely has an impact in the UK. We all feel it on a daily basis in the energy sector, but it's also always important to look what if anything, it might have done on the European Union side. And Jana and Fabian are doing that in relation to renewable energy in the European Union. Then Eleanor Reeves and Maurice Sheridan explore the UK environmental law and policy post-Brexit. So it's like sort of not quite renewable energy, but looking what does environmental law look like post-Brexit? So what are the issues? And is Eleanor? Yes. Oh, I can see Eleanor has dialed in as well. Welcome and thank you. And so this is an important assessment, stepping away, because looking at a lot of the, and this comes through in the chapter, a lot of environmental law during the membership of the UK in the European Union was of course derived from European Union law. So post-Brexit, what is the impact, and is there a possibility that the UK diverges from the European Union? Ian, who's in the room, Ian then sort of looks in the next chapter, he looks at Brexit and Euratom. Anthony, I think you coined the word Brexatom at one point. So what sort of the European, it wasn't actually in the public debate very much at all. Anthony, you said energy wasn't in the public debate, but I think Brexatom was sort of the best kept secret. It wasn't on the ballot in the referendum, and then all of a sudden government pulled the trigger on the 106A notice pursuant to the Euratom Treaty. Ian looks in this chapter, what does Brexit mean for Euratom? I've always joked that if nuclear is probably the only area of Brexit that sort of works post-Brexit, but Ian, you might disagree, and I'm keen to discuss that in more detail, because it was negotiated away from politics and the public eye in particular. Disputes. Anna and Wendy Miles are looking this in some detail as to what does Brexit mean for energy disputes, in particular from an arbitration perspective, and what are the challenges and opportunities. So there are a number of implications, because obviously being part of the European Union also comes with effectively an administrative scaffolding, sort of rules and regulations which simply fall away post-Brexit, and Anna and Wendy are exploring that in great detail. I already mentioned that Ireland has a very special case in relation to Brexit. We've all heard it in relation to the Northern Ireland Protocol, the Windsor Framework, but in relation to energy, of course, it has a very special status, because the island of Ireland is unified for the purposes of the electricity market. So all of a sudden, and that worked beautifully in the context of the European Union. Post-Brexit, we have Northern Ireland subject to the same electricity rules as before. That implies some European Union rules as well in Northern Ireland in the energy sector. And it also means, for instance, 2 carbon prices in Northern Ireland. For the Republic of Ireland, it also means that supply security has come into sharp focus. There are a couple of government consultations from the Irish government at the moment. I'm just looking whether I can see the Irish contributors. I thought I saw them earlier, but I can't pick them out immediately from the colleagues who've dialed in. And so Ireland is sort of the first of 2 special studies that the book is undertaking in relation to specific geographies or jurisdictions. The second stems from Jean-Christophe Fuchs, who has dialed in. I've seen him, if you want to come on camera and say hi. And as a former Swiss ambassador to the EU, Jean-Christophe Fuchs explores the example of Switzerland. So how does, is there anything that we can learn from the Swiss-EU relations in relation on energy for the UK-EU experience? And Jean-Christophe does that in great detail. We then have, as the last substantive chapter, in Hebrew they say the last is the most beloved, but Dorothy Smith explores the challenges ahead. So did get Brexit done, we explore that in some detail, but there's so many things that come at the UK and come at the European Union from so many different directions, whether it be it energy crisis, the Russian invasion of Ukraine, many sort of constitutional political questions or energy political issues that will arise, and Dorothy explores that. Anna and I then conclude by saying Brexit didn't get done. There are a number of things that are still up in the air. It's a number of continuous issues. It's not quite a continuous revolution, but it's a continuous sort of a continuous process that will be with us for many years to come. And therefore we've called the last chapter, This is in You, of a conclusion, because this isn't over yet. And but with this, I will conclude my introductory remarks and the overview of the book, and we'll hand over to Anna.
Thank you, Silke, and thank you, Anthony, and thank you everyone for coming here today. I thought maybe before we go into a discussion, and hopefully a discussion around the table, and including the people who are online, on where we are on specific aspects of the relationship now that impact on the energy sector, perhaps just to say a few words on what the TCA actually does and in terms of the energy sector, and why we are with Silke saying that we are going to be effectively near permanent negotiations on the energy sector and energy relations going forward. And I think the key thing here is to basically say that the TCA is very different to any other trade agreement that we've seen up to now. It's basically a mechanism whereby it manages future divergence in regulatory relations rather than trying to bring cooperation together. I mean, it certainly has the possibility of there being an energy cooperation agreement going forward, but as it is now and what it has in terms of its provisions now, it doesn't have that. It's just a very general undertaking, whether it's on energy security, which simply says we shall cooperate on energy on security of supply, and sort of leaves it at that. So there's no mechanism of solidarity, there are no details on anything. But one of the things that really puts the energy sector in a very precarious position is the fact that the chapters of the TCA on energy are provisional in nature, in the sense that unless there is an agreement before the 30th of June 2026 on either that, what is in the TCA remaining on as the basis for an agreement, or something else replacing it, it basically falls away. And it effectively falls away at exactly at the same time that the fisheries deal falls away. And if we remember the last 2 years of anything trying to be agreed between the EU and the UK in terms of energy, it was very closely related to whatever the disputes were on fisheries. I mean, we can recall Macron at some point, you know, when the fisheries dispute was at the very height of its of the discussions, you know, threatening to cut electricity supply to us here. So, you know, what has happened is effectively moving away from, or what Brexit has, where we are as a result of Brexit is a politicization of energy. Whereas whilst the UK was within the EU, and the whole object of the internal market is a depoliticization of energy policy, what is now certainly at the fore in terms of the UK and the EU, is very much the two being linked together. And so there's this the temporary nature of the arrangements makes it very uncertain. And that uncertainty is on both sides of the pond, in the sense that there's uncertainty in terms of relations of the energy sector with respect to the EU investing here and vice versa. And I think as Sir Philip Lowe in his preface to our book says, you know, in a time of where transition is from when we're moving to net zero, it's really the cooperation that is key. And one of the themes that we explore in very much detail in the book is the role of interconnectors and the importance of interconnectors, both for the UK primarily, but also for the EU in terms of energy security, basically as a balancing resource to ensure delivery of that. And here Ambassador Fueg is very clear on the difficulties that exist between Switzerland and the EU on cooperation, which is clearly now something that we are experiencing between the EU and the UK. Maybe just to briefly, at least a bit more explore this difference between the TCA and a typical trade agreement is, so as I said, it basically it's a mechanism of managing future divergence. What that basically means is that it provides, and we talk about this specifically in the last chapter, we basically say that the TCA circumscribes the right of signatories to regulate in order to achieve legitimate public policy goals to those based on objective and non-discriminatory criteria, and then simply imposes a non-regression obligation. So although it's the TCA is hailed as this amazing document which puts climate change constraints at the heart of the level playing field, but the reality of it is that it's simply a non-regression obligation. And to the extent that there is a non-regression, and there's two things here to emphasize. One is that the non-regression obligation is with respect to obligations, for example, with respect to renewables targets, and climate change targets. They're all linked to 2030 targets, not any targets like post 2030. So they're sort of historically stuck in time. They're stuck in time at the end of the transition period. So that's the sort of the measurement by which we look at the non-regression obligation. And then what it actually then provides, that if there is a regression, then there is a possibility, sort of along the lines of the WTO mechanism, to be able to take proportionate rebalancing measures. So effectively countermeasures. So it's nothing like what we would see in a trade agreement of a normal nature. So I think just going back to what Anthony said, just to understand, energy wasn't really given much emphasis during the Brexit negotiations, and it's quite revealed by the fact that only 16 out of 1,200 pages of the TCA are dedicated to energy. And now, of course, it's good to hear that the government sees energy and climate change as an important policy driver. But now we have the difficulty that effectively we are in a different situation post-Brexit, and that makes it much harder to achieve. And maybe, I don't know whether Silke, I think whether we want to explore now the interconnector role in more detail, but I leave it to you which topic you want to touch upon now, as after the introduction. I think this.
Yeah, I think we should start with interconnectors, if that's okay. I mean, I think it's in many ways the physical manifestation of Brexit, and I think it'd be interesting to hear people's views of whether or not how this is changing, because at least from my perspective, last year was very interesting in terms of the seeming to be increased desire for cooperation between the UK and the EU in relation to the operation of interconnectors. The UK rejoining or saying it's going to rejoin the North Sea Grid Initiative, etc. So, do you think that things are moving in a positive direction? But you talk about, and with Ambassador Frug's chapter, in terms of the inherent problems that there are, but will these be overcome, or to some degree at least? Sure.
Let me start with the last point you mentioned about the North Sea Energies Corporation. So actually, sort of the UK North Sea Energy Law Corporation North Sea Energy Corporation is a funny thing, because it's not technically an EU anything. Norway is involved. It is sort of a regional, private inverted commas, state initiative, which the European Union very much feels ownership of, but technically it's actually a part. The European Union then made clear that the UK had to leave as part of Brexit. And then the UK joined again in December of last year. There's a memorandum of understanding to that effect. I think that's a greatly positive effect. I've just come yesterday from a meeting in Norway discussing sort of multi-purpose interconnectors effectively in the North Sea area. So how to connect future wind farms in Norway to those in Denmark, Germany, Belgium, Netherlands and UK. And the number of times that, and the UK, and we can discuss this in ENSO-E and with the European Commission, and then, and with you guys. So there was a little bit of, there's definitely a positive step in the right direction. It's a good policy forum, but it's not a decision-making forum. In relation to interconnectors, a number of difficulties remain. First of all, the trading of electricity is on no deal terms. So sort of we basically back for UK interconnectors where we were in 2014. So you need to, or prior to the market coupling in the European Union, you need to reserve capacity on the interconnector. You then need to reserve the energy that you want to trade across. There's no longer any implicit trading and netting. So that's quite inefficient. I was at an inquiry of the House of Lords in November, and a spokesperson for EFET estimated that this inefficiency costs tens, if not hundreds of millions in inefficiencies over time.
Per year?
No, he was sort of since Brexit, I think it was his quote. So,
well, I think Paul Hallis has figures of 400 million a year, so it's quite.
Could I just pick up? Was Paul's analysis done pre-Brexit? Because there was a number of economic analysis that was done before the referendum, and it was
after the referendum.
Right,
Paul's analysis. Yeah, but it was Adam Berman from EFET who spoke to this at the House of Lords, and he sort of the figure was he was really quite high. It was dozens, if not hundreds of millions. So I will look up the exact figure, but it was that sort of order. But that is for operational interconnectors. The next challenge is future interconnectors. The European Union provides a beautiful sort of like integrated regulatory regime. Interconnectors, with the NRAs of both connecting countries, they will agree a regulatory regime. If they can't agree, it escalates to ACER. Here we have a different situation now. Ofgem has just opened, or rather the third window for the cap and floor regime for interconnectors. There are, I think, 7 that have been taken forward on an in-principle basis that are eligible for this. It will now be interesting to see how that plays out, if, for instance, when regulatory regimes will need to be agreed. In addition, the difficulty is for interconnectors who would like to go for the exempt regime, in principle, 2 versions of how to do an interconnector, regulated route or exempt route. Both are equally valid and have been done in the past. In relation to the exemptions, it is quite difficult because whilst the TCA foresees an exemption from certain things like unbundling, like third-party access where required, it is not entirely clear who would grant such an exemption on the European Union side. So there is a specialized committee, but that hasn't been appointed to grant this. There's no authority. It's not clear whether it's the national regulatory authorities in the member states, or whether it's the European Commission, or whether it's ACER, or some form of some combination of the same. So there's some uncertainty here. And the fact that Ofgem is, of course, whilst they have good contacts, I'm told, with ACER, and whilst National Grid is, of course, in good contact with NSOE, it is not the same as being a member. It is not the same as sitting in the ACER meetings. And so therefore, there are a number of uncertainties and difficulties. The other thing is, of course, that as long as the trading arrangements are what they are, and let's face it, multi-region low volume coupling is also not the same or an equivalent to price coupling in terms of efficiency. That may also have an impact on the interconnectors in due course on the financing and then the cost basis or revenue basis, which hasn't been explored. So again, there's more uncertainty.
Yeah, and I think, and the fundamental uncertainty is the provisional nature of whatever deal is there now. Because if it falls away by 2026 and nobody knows whether it'll even be extended on the basis that we have now, there's a fundamental uncertainty that underlines whatever arrangement is agreed now. So, but maybe just to understand why we're emphasizing interconnectors as such a key thing in terms of future relations. I mean, at least if we talk about it from the point of view of the UK, I mean, the idea is, at least from the basis of the government policy now, is that offshore wind is sort of the driver, the backbone of the electricity system by 2050. And so interconnectors then become an important mechanism for actually the balancing. I mean, it's seen, I mean, the UK certainly wants to see itself as potentially a net exporter of electricity. So the net export would obviously be to the EU, but also in terms of the balancing generally, the whole idea is if you want to have a market that functions and the system that functions, then you need to have this interoperability in place. And so the idea is that interconnectivity or interconnectors are meant to grow in terms of just the sheer size of them and quantities from 6 gigawatt to at least 18 gigawatt by 2050. So it's a fundamental precondition for achieving the net zero strategy of the government, which we will learn more about by the end of this month, what it is. But interconnectors are fundamental to it. And yet Silke describes in detail how the things are not working. And, you know, the special committee, what has met on energy has met 3 or 4 times. It's not expected to meet more than twice a year. And up until now, all it has said is get on with the calculation of the cost benefit analysis of how do we improve the capacity mechanism on the interconnector. And that's as far as it can go. So we're really hamstrung in this. And so the entire UK energy strategy is actually hamstrung by the situation that it's in. So, I mean, I don't, let's not open it to the EU because it'll open another Pandora box of problems. But yeah, that's.
Are there points on that? I mean, can I just pick up on one thing and then while people gather their thoughts? I mean, just we have seen the completion of a number of interconnectors since Brexit. We have seen the starting of the planning of others. So there was a hiatus, I think, for a couple of years, and maybe there's still a hiatus with France in terms of that, but things are moving in a way that, yeah. I don't think you comment
maybe on
that.
the two interconnectors,
Yeah.
there's sort of a disconnect between what makes sense and sort of some of the sort of Brexit issues. I think, Anthony, it was you a few years ago when we sat in the library, you said Brexit is a political project. Yes, it is a political project, but that doesn't always mean that it makes economic sense. So in case of two interconnectors, we've seen Greenlink between Ireland and GB come sort of take a final investment decision, and we've seen the same for NeuConnect. So that doesn't mean that there weren't issues in the negotiations and on both sides, but it also means that in particular the German government was incredibly pragmatic in saying, yeah, okay, NeuConnect is a third country interconnector, but in as far as the German legislation, which was created specifically for NeuConnect, it was almost disregarded that there was a Brexit issue, but that was because the German government wanted to. There's no obligation as such. And this comes back to Brexit has made things more political. We're dealing much more with governments, whether or not they want a particular project, and whether particular regulatory regimes are actually flexible enough to allow third country interconnectors, because the entire regime is effectively set up for intra-EU interconnectors to achieve the internal energy market.
And I guess the Aquin example of not making it on the PCI list by the fact that France blocked it is an example again of the difficulties we're in, because obviously that wouldn't have been possible before. And you know, they even went, Aquin even went to the European Court of Justice to try to challenge that, and failed a few weeks ago in that challenge. So, you know, this is a much more difficult situation that the potential investors in interconnectors are finding themselves in.
And I think that is specific to France in particular, because in France, sort of the UK is, with Germany, one of the few, there are a number of countries where you can have private sponsored interconnectors, or rather non-incumbing TSOs, because many of the TSOs are, of course, also private companies. So in Germany, it's possible. In the UK, it has been possible for a long time. In France, it's only possible on the basis of an exemption under European law. And this is Article 63 of the electricity regulation. The TCA has an exemption regime, but the granting of an exemption under European law to a UK incoming interconnector is not possible, because it's technically not an interconnector for European Union purposes. An interconnector is only a piece of, all engineers will tell you it's an interconnector, but basically a piece of equipment that links two member states. So if you apply the TCA definition of an interconnector, that works, but again, we don't know who would grant an exemption. So there are lots of uncertainties, and quite frankly, it's also political. I remember I had a meeting with the CRE, the French National Regulatory Authority, very shortly after the referendum, and a British delegation sort of discussing interconnectors, and sort of there was a moment where the president, sort of one of the commission members of the CRE, looked at me and said, "Mais qu'est-ce que vous faites ici encore? Like, what are you still doing here, you British?" Because there was a very clear sort of political feeling that Brexit had destroyed quite a number of relations there. And I think that feeling lingers. Things are moving. There's the declaration of the French Republic and the UK regarding energy cooperation of the 10th of March. Interconnectors are in there, but again, it is a political declaration. It is not an administrative right to apply for the exemption, to go and request an authorization. So that proves to be quite complex.
Great. Any other points on interconnectors, or I will move us on to the exciting issue of state aids. Was important, I would say, in terms of the referendum. It was a discussion more generally in terms of the UK being free from decisions from Brussels. My feeling was always that the UK got what it wanted prior to the referendum in terms of energy. I mean, you can look at Hinkley, some of the other nuclear bailouts. If countries tended to want projects being pushed through, then there was a negotiation, but it didn't tend to block them. But obviously outside the EU, then we're free to some degree, and I'll be interested to get a sense from you how free the UK is to determine the sort of support it wants to give. But maybe also bringing it very currently, we have the new rules in terms of the EU proposing, I don't think, can I say a free-for-all? But anyway, to a changing to allow member states much more freedom on energy state aid, and in particular to support the energy transition. So, and that in response to the Inflation Reduction Act in the United States. So I think very current. So yeah, it'd be good to get your views in terms of why state aid was important for the energy sector pre-referendum, what difference is made now, and maybe going forward, how things might change if the EU is significantly changing its rules in order to support industries in response to the energy transition.
So maybe I'll start here. So I mean, there's as Silke said, there's an entire chapter that George Perez, one of the specialists on state aid, leading specialist in state aid, looks at this issue. The post-Brexit regime basically kicked off 4th of January of this year. So we have now something called the Subsidy Control Act, which effectively replaces the EU state aid mechanism that we had until now in the UK. But a proviso being that actually it's not entirely replaced, in the sense that we actually have now 2 state aid separate regimes. One to the extent that it applies to Northern Ireland, and then the one that applies to outside the Northern Ireland. And then saying outside the Northern Ireland is again too simplistic a way of looking at it, because actually what you have to do, even if you're dealing with something that has otherwise you think no connection to the Northern Ireland, you have to actually assess if there's a real risk of whatever the public authority is doing in terms of giving economic, well, let's call it simply granting a subsidy. You have to look at whether it has a real risk of impacting on trade between Northern Ireland and the EU. And then if you decide that there is a real risk, you have to go and assess the EU state aid aspect, wherever you are. In terms of the UK Subsidy Control Act, I mean, the claim is that what we now have is a lighter touch, quicker, fair and simpler way of doing things. And it may well be that over time that is what it's going to be, because as somebody who does a lot of work in the EU state aid, it is highly complex, highly bureaucratic, and anything is better than what it is in the EU as far as I'm concerned. But the question is whether this move away from this kind of rigid notification and approval mechanism which the EU has, to something where effectively the public authorities, and this is where it becomes really difficult, have a lot of discretion, and they have to effectively self-assess whether something is going to be the breach of the subsidy system. And they have to decide whether they actually want to apply and inform and seek approval of the mechanism beforehand. So there's a completely different way of doing it now. And so there's a lot of uncertainty, because it's obviously completely new, and the administrative burden on the public authorities of having to self-assess is going to be extremely high, because where are they going to have the experts to help them do this? So it's going to be a hard process. I mean, obviously there's money has already been given by the government pursuant to this scheme and so on, but the entire process is a different one. And the actual potential of being able to judicially review as someone who claims that they are affected by a subsidy is another additional thing, which in a way is certainly a mechanism that is more accountable. And I think it is right that they are judicially reviewed, unlike in the EU where it wasn't, but it adds another level of uncertainty to anyone who actually is a beneficiary of state aid or subsidy in the UK going forward to what it was before. So certainly it's something that is completely new, and that creates the uncertainty that otherwise wasn't there prior to Brexit, as it is a new system. But I mean, the hope is that it will be a movement to the better. And so state aid is clearly one of those areas of law where we will see regulatory divergence. Already we are in a regulatory divergence between the two bit in the UK on the one side and the EU on the other. And so to the extent that they are along the same path in terms of energy transition and targets, you could say that the logic behind the subsidies that will be given are the same. But the reality of the matter is that it'll be still assessed by reference to specific projects and therefore assessed by reference to different the assessment will be different. So there's certainly going to be this possibility of there being a difference between the two. The EU, I mean, what can I say on the EU Net Zero Industry Act and the whole basically revamping of state aid? I mean, as far as I can see, it's basically saying it's free for all. You just get money for whatever you want now in the EU. I mean, there's a huge amount of opposition even in the EU to the revamping of the state aid regime, because it effectively will allow very rich countries to subsidize their own industry, like Germany or France, whereas the other countries, whether it's Slovenia, Estonia, whoever else who has no money, they effectively will not be able to do that because they simply won't be able to afford it. So we're effectively, if the state aid regime is redefined in the way that the European Commission is proposing now, we're basically going to see a completely destruction of any kind of internal market, as far as I can tell, or any kind of level playing field. So it's certainly a recipe for any other exiteers, I would say, coming along. And so in that respect, the revamping of the state aid might be something that will effectively bring the wind into the sail of Brexiteers here to say, look, this is what's happening. It's actually a free-for-all thing in the EU, and we're better off outside it. At least we have a say on how we're going to devise our own subsidy mechanism. But I don't know, Silke, what else?
Sort of one, I'm not a state aid expert, so I will sort of not comment in great detail. Sort of, I leave that to the experts in the book. And I just there's one point, Anna, that you made about divergence, and sort of this is a theme that pops up in relation to state aid. Also, there's a geopolitical dimension with the US. So, and that, of course, in turn has its own geopolitical dimension. So energy security and state aid for energy is such a hot potato precisely because energy security makes the economy to go round and sort of is so fundamental. And this is why I think I was always surprised that energy wasn't more in the public debate in relation to energy. One of the things where we see probably also will see more divergence is actually the very design of the electricity market. We haven't mentioned it in the book in great detail because it was just starting when we were about to go to print. So the UK government had started in last July a several-month-long consultation about the future of the electricity arrangement, of the review of the electricity market arrangement, REMA. Every good energy initiative needs an abbreviation, so REMA. So REMA is potentially so wide. So from tinkering sort of at the edges, making some minor changes to the contracts for difference, all the way to changing the whole way that electricity is traded through nodal points, which means sort of effectively splitting up the GB market and having different regional pricing zones, which is sort of at nodal points. The European Union is doing the very same thing. Except for, of course, they're not doing it together or in a coordinated way. So we could potentially see, depending on the European Commission has adopted its proposal on the European Union, following the European Union consultation on the future of the EU electricity market yesterday. Now, I was in the meeting all day yesterday, so I haven't had the chance to look at it in an awful lot of detail, but my big fear is that effectively the two electricity markets being designed without talking to one another. And then that may result in more friction. So that's one to watch out, perhaps.
Can I wait for other people to pick up? Yeah. But where do we think things like carbon border tax adjustment mechanisms fit into this in terms of state aid rules, potential divergence? Does that ensure some sort of harmonization or financial retribution if they diverge very much? I mean, does this play any role if it's adopted within the EU?
I think CBAM will play a huge role because it effectively is an export mechanism of the EU ETS. So the EU ETS as carbon price setter will play a global role after that. And the UK ETS has tracked slightly above the EU ETS, chiefly because I think the market isn't quite as liquid. It's not that sort of the carbon price is higher for any other sort of political reason here, but also not consistently higher. So there were significant moments where it sort of where it wasn't. But so I think as a result of CBAM, first of all, everybody globally will be a carbon price taker in relation to the European Union, because that will be the lead price. And everybody, including the UK, will need to deal with it, sort of in some shape or form, sort of for the exports, and it will play a bureaucratic role. It will play a climate change role, but I think the jury is out as to sort of how that will influence the UK and whether it might motivate the UK to perhaps rejoin the EU ETS or link the UK ETS to the EU ETS.
That's a question.
Yeah, we've got 2 questions online. I wonder if either of you want to come in and ask your question directly, John Mason or Angus Johnston.
Thank you. I'll go first if it's okay. Yeah, apologies, it's quite a generic question. I was just wondering if any of the authors see any impact from Brexit on the retail sector. So I completely understand the impact on interconnectors and broader market arrangements, and that could have an impact on long-term balancing and price. But I guess, is there any more specific impacts anyone sees that ordinary consumers will see in their interactions with the energy sector?
Andrew, did you want to come in on this? No. Okay.
Thank you very much, John. Excellent question. I think ultimately, if at the wholesale price, step back. The retail market, although there are non-UK companies in the retail market, of course, is chiefly a domestic or national market, and that is in terms of the trade, and that is true in all European Union member states as well as the UK. The chief impact that I see, and then welcome other views of others, of course, is that because energy trading is more inefficient, because energy pricing is significantly higher in the UK. I've followed the EPEX pricing. It's an intraday trade in the autumn prior to the invasion of Ukraine. So there, the UK balancing market prices and the UK intraday trading prices were significantly higher as compared to the coupled market in the European Union. And that was a difference to GB prices have traditionally been higher, but they were significantly higher during that phase. And that is sort of the only phase I could look at which didn't have the Ukraine effect, or the Russian effect, I should say, on top. So ultimately, I think higher prices in the balancing and wholesale markets mean higher prices for consumers, and therefore the retail market will be affected. It also means that suppliers who cannot withstand that sort of spark spread, or sort of have issues with those sort of wholesale prices, and may have sort of, there's a greater risk of suppliers as well. So more uncertainty, John, is I think the answer, and higher prices.
Angus, did you want to come in?
Hi there. Yeah. Hope you can hear me okay. Yes. Apologies, camera's not working. Fascinated by all the discussion so far. I'm particularly interested by Anna's comment concerning the sort of EU changes to state aid law and how this could lead to a kind of subsidies free-for-all and internal market damage. I was wondering what you thought the potential interaction between member state actions on that basis would be with free movement law, on the basis that, looking at some of the judgments 7-8 years ago, it struck me that the Court of Justice was starting to become more potentially interventionist in scrutinizing subsidies which might clear the state aid regime but might still create free movement issues. So the state aid regime may not be so directive anymore in controlling what member states do in terms of subsidy plans, but is there a possibility that the free movement regime might actually step in and do some of the work? Thank you.
Well, Angus, I would only hope that the court would become interventionist in this kind of a way. I mean, I would imagine that the general whole argument of competition law would need to also be considered. But I think my concern is that that it won't play that role, because I think there's going to be a position taken by all institutions in the EU, including the court, that we have no other option other than to follow suit by and respond to what the US is doing. And in order to remain, as they say, competitive, which I don't agree with at all as the analysis, but we have to effectively adopt this kind of costly subsidies raised to the bottom, which is, I think, where we're sort of being herded into by both politicians on both sides of the Atlantic. So I think this is my main concern, that the obsession with government intervention seems to be a prevalent position amongst politicians around the world, which is a completely different ball game to where we were even just a few years ago, where this kind of public intervention would have been completely unimaginable. And we're effectively replacing private investment by public investment. And when I say public, I'm talking about printing money, because the governments certainly have no money. So for me, the idea that the US Inflation Reduction Act, for me, is actually a inflation encouragement act, because actually it's simply going to actually place more money on the market in the US. So I mean, it's all reverse. And I sort of feel that we are in a time where what is being said and what is being done is not the same thing.
Anything to respond to that, Angus, or other people? I think it's a fascinating discussion. I mean, it really
just very briefly, maybe. I mean, it strikes me that there's a very interesting dynamic that one started off by promising a great deal from the market, and in many ways it delivered a great deal. But of course, the difficulty is when then shocks and difficulties happen that the market isn't able to respond to, or isn't well designed to respond to, then it immediately leads to the knee-jerk response that, you know, we must be saved from the markets by government and public intervention. And that then feeds this perspective in terms of, right, and it's not only that we have to be saved from the price problems or the supply problems, but we also have to redesign and restructure everything. And the only people who can do that are going to be interventions by government, because market hasn't delivered. And so we end up with, if we sort of overpromise with what markets might do, then we end up in a situation where we almost feed a request for interventionism, even if the result of that is not necessarily going to be very positive.
Well, I would actually only, I mean, I agree with the second part, but I'll challenge the first proposition. I don't agree that the markets haven't delivered. I think the markets have completely delivered. They have, I mean, gas is scarce as a result of the sanctions introduced against Russia. So we have a scarce commodity in the EU. That has resulted in a clear indication in higher prices. And even pre the Russian invasion of the Ukraine, we had systemic difficulty in the way in which gas was being dealt with. So I don't agree. I think it's the reverse. I think it's failing to recognize that the market was delivering, because the market was delivering something that the governments didn't want to hear. And that is that their own interventions were causing problems, and the market was giving a signal. And if we look at what the market has done since then, the market has given another signal now, as the concerns, at least temporarily, in terms of gas shortages in the EU has abated. But the reality of the scarcity that we have in terms of gas situation in the EU has remained, in fact. And we were just here, in October, November last year, in this room discussing this under Chatham House rules. So I won't be saying who said what, but I mean, we were already then identifying the continuing gas gap in the EU, and therefore that will lead to gas market signals going forward, and the gas price will go up unless there is something done to change the underlying reality of that. So I think that I would disagree about the market playing its role. I'm concerned that the attempts to now effectively throw the market in the bin is effectively taking us into where I grew up in, and that was former Yugoslavia, where we had a managed economy, and it didn't work. So the idea that the whole world is now going to go into a system that hasn't delivered in socialist and communist countries seems quite ironic to me after the fall of the Berlin Wall.
Anna, forgive me, I wasn't subscribing to the narrative, I was just describing the narrative.
Oh, okay, very good.
I didn't think Angus was sort of going down a sort of planned communist economy sort of narrative at all. The one thing that strikes me, though, is that in whatever regime, sort of whether it's EU state aid regime, whether it's CFDs in the UK, whether it's Subsidy Control Act, whether it's in America, it seems to be that the energy sector is always very closely married somehow to the narrative of subsidies. So that is not a new issue. And I'm just wondering, because it's not because the energy market needs those subsidies, or because the subsidies are meant to push sort of the market in a certain direction. So because obviously we have sort of overarching energy policy objectives, decarbonization, the amount of renewables that a government would like to see on the system. Interconnection is another one that will interconnect us in the UK and the EU are ultimately consumer subscribed or underwritten. And I remember this was a long time before the Brexit debate, even sort of in 2014-15, we had a large debate around sort of what is the future of the energy market in terms of the renewable, sort of the push for offshore wind effectively. And the fact that to some extent CFDs had started to deliver. Will the energy market always need some form of directive subsidies, in the sense we want a particular outcome from the market, therefore we need to tell the market that for certain types of technologies, investment money is available from the state? I'm looking in particular at CCUS for the future and hydrogen, in, by the way, 2 areas the TCA doesn't touch on. Anna, you've used the word, it's regressive, or it's sort of frozen in time. In relation to technologies, the TCA certainly is frozen in time, because it has one sort of hint at new technologies, but it doesn't actually describe any cooperation in relation to hydrogen or CCUS. So that's probably something for the next review.
Andrew, I'm aware we've got like 5 minutes, so Andrew, and then if anyone else wants to add their questions, we'll always get to the end of the day and everyone's
very quickly. It's so wonderful to hear such a forthright defence of the markets. It doesn't get said often enough, so thank you for that, Anna. I just wonder, out of noting the headline for the book about implications and opportunities, I heard that clearly anything is simpler than the EU state aid regime. But I wonder what other opportunities you thought there might be.
always a good one. Opportunities for Brexit.
I have something polemic to say on this.
Okay, maybe just one opportunity that we've identified it already in the book. I mean, I think there's quite a number. I think it's fair to say that being outside the EU gives the UK certainly flexibility, if there is political will, to make things things differently and tailor-made to the UK needs. And I think if we just stick to energy, our energy position and energy mix is quite different to that of other countries. So seeking to achieve energy transition and making it without having to reach a consensus with another 27 member states that have their own interests and difficulties now, perhaps makes it easier for us to achieve the targets that we need to do. Caveat all the things that the government is not doing, including the fact that it was successfully judicially reviewed. The net zero strategy was judicially reviewed, and hence for insufficient detail. So we have lots of problems there. One of the opportunities in terms of general opportunities that as a lawyer and as a practicing lawyer I see that Brexit has brought is in fields of arbitration. And I would suspect that energy contracts will, to the extent that people are aware, be governed by English law, at least have seats of arbitration in the UK or London, or whether Scotland. Brandon's here, representing Scotland here, simply as a way to insulate contracts from EU law. So, and this is already happening. So, so that might be, and also for enforcement of arbitration awards, as a result of the way in which the EU, for example, even in the renewable sector, has deemed arbitration awards that have been granted to, for example, renewable solar panel project sponsors who have had their feed-in tariffs slashed in Spain or elsewhere, seeking to enforce those awards here because they can't do it in the EU. So there's going to be a lot of forum shopping in that respect, and certainly lawyers may benefit from Brexit, and also energy companies that do so. So I see English law potentially playing an even bigger role in terms of energy governing law for energy contracts. What else can we say? There are opportunities.
Yeah.
You said you wanted to be polemic. So.
Yes.
Final remarks, and then we let people go, and then we can carry on chatting around
Very
coffee
quickly.
in the room.
This is probably one area where we slightly disagree in perspective. Sort of, I always sort of joke that the opportunities are on the first page here, sort of between on the white page between the handbook and the introduction, chiefly because as a transactional lawyer and a corporate lawyer, I have not seen sort of any benefit. What I've seen is a lot of uncertainty. Actually, people in relation to energy, gas and electricity trading contracts going away from English law, and even if it means that certain things, state aid, might go quicker in the UK, or that there might be arbitral advantages, I think overall the disadvantages outweigh any advantages that there might be. I'm very skeptical as to any opportunities that will arise out of Brexit. Sorry.
Well, I'll just end there by just simply saying that having fought and being part of the debate on the price cap in the EU on gas pricing, and being involved in that, one of the things that certainly has happened and that Brexit has allowed to happen is that ICE, who runs the TTF in Holland, has effectively said and has already established the TTF UK version, so that to the extent that the price cap is triggered for gas prices in the EU, there will be a parallel system in the UK for trading of gas, and obviously that is certainly not something that wouldn't have been possible before, and while you can say that might be undermining effectively EU policy, but it'll also be a mechanism for allowing the market to operate. So you can see it whichever way you want.
Well, thank you both very much. It's always a delight to have such experts in the room. Even though I've worked on it for many years, I still learn a huge amount from you both. So thank you very much. Thank you very much for the people online for joining us. Do go on Amazon. It's now available, so you can order the book today. And I'm sure it will be delivered very rapidly. So yeah, do that. We have copies for sale in the room. But yes, just thank you all very much indeed for coming along.
Thank you very much.